coastal plan's the latest piece of planning legislation that the Queensland Government is introducing. It's an adjunct to the current coastal management plan, and it increases the jurisdiction widely in the coastal plain, all the way up the coast of Queensland. Some 100,000 properties in Queensland are affected by this new piece of planning legislation. It has at its core a restrictive process which has got the potential to restrict existing approvals, existing planning scheme, development options substantially. And it's a real challenge for the development industry to be having to come to grips with at these difficult economic times that we face. I guess with housing affordability.
Yeah, so I guess that's my primary concern, is the impact that it will have on creating more uncertainty for the industry, but also the adverse impact it will have on the adequate supply of housing in the communities, especially in the regional centres that are going to be pushed to breaking point literally by the resources boom and the fact that they need to provide adequate housing for the skilled labour that needs to be attracted to those centres, but also the key workers that often can't afford to compete with the guys working in the mines for housing, but are so key to creating a livable community. You know, your nurses and doctors and teachers. You know, the fact of the matter is that often the people working in the resources sector earn more than the doctors, so you know they're getting pushed out of the market as well, and just creates another level of uncertainty that the finance sector can use as being risk, so that they need to then be compensated on, and it prevents them from doing deals, I suppose.
Well, it's incredibly restrictive to the point that in places like Townsville, where you've got major impacts in respect to tidal inundation, to future sea level rise, that a small business that's currently a fish and chip shop, mum and dad business in that locality, if it's within those restrictive areas, they can't expand their business. They can't add an additional employee. So they can't intensify. The policy is saying you cannot intensify residential dwelling numbers, you can't intensify working numbers within areas that are key areas of infrastructure, existing infrastructure, CBDs in regional places like Mackay and Townsville, let alone thinking about the impacts in places like the Sunshine Coast or the Gold Coast.
And I suppose it flies in the face of the push within the regional plans throughout Queensland for infill and intensification of development around areas where there's existing infrastructure, and the very nature of humanity to congregate around water means that a lot of areas where there's an intensification of infrastructure and services and amenities is already where the water is. And so what this plan is basically doing is preventing development or intensification around those areas. And what we'll see, Pete's example of the fish and chip shop in, say, Railway Estate in Townsville, that fish and chip shop will move away from that area and decrease the level of amenity and services within those areas, which decreases their quality of life and will mean that, you know, the sort of macro result will be that Townsville won't be able to attract the skilled workforce it requires to achieve the economic growth potential of that area.
The reality is that the overlaying of some of the legislative framework, such as the ecological requirements that are drawing from existing legislative frameworks of Vegetation Management, of Nature Conservation Act, effectively it's picking up, duplicating those, adding additional requirements that have to be assessed, and therefore potentially sterilising areas which currently could have development potential.
And I think Pete and I will agree on this, is that there's no doubt that there's an issue that needs to be addressed in terms of climate change. But what we would like to see is that the government, the legislature, actually assists in facilitating industry to innovate and adapt and become basically adaptive to these issues, and not being restrictive and preventing the open market from operating fully, basically, because what that's going to do is discourage economic development, discourage social development, and then, you know, that'll have an adverse impact on the environment, I think.
But it must have, Richard, I think the growth strategies that have been put in place in southeast Queensland and the various regional centres up the coast now have got some significant pressures on them, because essentially these frameworks such as the cropping legislation, the coastal legislation and other frameworks that are introduced are gradually shrinking that extent of the urban footprint that's available for development. So hence we can't produce the numbers of houses and products that we thought we had in those areas.
And so, you know, it's the other plans such as the koala plan and, you know, the high quality ag land legislation and everything else is sort of pushing from the fringes of the urban footprint, but what this is then is restricting development within the areas that are going to offer the highest efficiency of development. So we're sort of getting pushed towards this no man's land where infill and high density res probably isn't as suitable.
I think that the thrust here needs to be more about a retreat process, a policy that actually identifies, and as we all agree that climate change is a significant issue, therefore sea level rise is a flow-on effect from that. But it's a flow-on effect that's 80 to 100 years out there. So we should be able to recognise the economic life of investment and cater for that in a adaptive strategy that allows those investments and mums and dads to realise their short-term returns, but then in the longer term design for that retreat, which can be accompanied in our economic strategies for our state.
Yeah, I think so, definitely.